8:15 a.m., August 6, 1945. The sky above Hiroshima is clear. No air raid sirens, no anti-aircraft fire. The city is waking up like any other morning of war. At over 31,000 feet, a lone B-29 holds a steady course. Inside its bomb bay is Little Boy. 15 kilotons of energy never before used in warfare. There will be no second chance. There will be no turning back. In 43 seconds, a decision is executed. A mechanism engages. A chain reaction begins. What follows is not a sound. It is light, brighter than the sun, erasing the city's center in a single instant. From that moment on, war changes, and the world enters a new era, forged in fire. The Second World War did not begin with the atomic bomb. It began with ambition. In the late 1930s, the global order was already fractured. In Europe, Nazi Germany rearmed at an unprecedented pace. In Asia and the Pacific, the Japanese Empire expanded through war, seizing territory, sea lanes, and resources. Two theaters, thousands of miles apart, driven by the same logic: victory through absolute power. When the war became global, no major power believed it would end quickly. This was no longer a contest of borders, it was a struggle for national survival. The war in the Pacific differed fundamentally from the war in Europe. It was not a continuous front. It was a war of islands, oceans, logistics, and attrition. After the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in late 1941, the United States entered the war with no path of retreat. The Pacific Fleet was damaged but not destroyed. That single fact ensured a long war, not a decisive opening blow. From 1942 through 1944, American strategy took shape. Island hopping. Key islands were seized one by one, Japanese supply lines were severed, and the front moved steadily closer to the home islands. Names like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa became more than places. They became markers of industrial-scale human loss. On each island, Japanese forces did not withdraw. They dug in, concealed themselves, and fought to the last man. In Japanese military doctrine, surrender did not exist. Survival after defeat was dishonor. For American planners, this created a grim equation. Every advance demanded blood, and the closer the war moved toward Japan itself, the higher the cost rose. In the spring of 1945, the Battle of Okinawa ended. 82 days of fighting. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers killed, tens of thousands of civilians dead. American losses were the heaviest of the entire Pacific War. Okinawa was not the Japanese home islands, but it showed what awaited any invasion of them. Military reports sent to Washington described a future without illusion. An invasion would last months. American casualties could reach into the hundreds of thousands. Japanese casualties, military and civilian, could number in the millions. These were not political estimates. They were calculations made by general staffs. By mid-1945, Japan no longer possessed the capacity to wage modern war. Its navy was largely neutralized. Its air force lacked fuel and fully trained pilots. Sea transport routes were severed. Strategic materials, oil, rubber, coal, were nearly exhausted. Major cities had already suffered devastating conventional bombing. Tokyo, Yokohama, and Osaka burned. Hundreds of thousands died in firestorms. Yet the critical fact remained: Japan did not surrender. Inside the government, deep divisions existed. Some civilian leaders recognized defeat, but military leaders still controlled decision-making, and they rejected unconditional surrender. The emperor held supreme spiritual authority, but did not directly command the war. His silence allowed the military system to continue on its own fatal momentum. In the United States, the war in Europe had ended. Germany surrendered in May 1945. Public pressure to bring soldiers home intensified. But the war against Japan continued. Every day meant more deaths, more prisoners suffering in camps, more resources consumed. President Harry S. Truman, newly in office after Franklin D. Roosevelt's death, faced the most consequential decision of his life. He was not a charismatic orator, but he understood the weight of the authority he carried. The options were laid out. Continue conventional bombing. Impose total blockade until Japan collapsed. Launch a full-scale invasion. Use an entirely new weapon. None were clean choices, only calculations of fewer deaths by wartime logic. The decision to use nuclear weapons did not arise in isolation. From early in the 1940s, the United States received alarming intelligence from Europe. German scientists were investigating nuclear energy for military purposes. Although Germany's nuclear program would later prove fragmented and under-resourced, at the time no one in Washington could be certain. The fear was not that Germany would succeed tomorrow. The fear was that if an enemy succeeded first, the world would lose the chance to respond. So a decision was made in absolute secrecy to unite scientific intellect, industrial capacity, and military authority into a single effort. The Manhattan Project had no precedent. It was not a small laboratory effort. It was a nationwide industrial network. Hundreds of thousands participated. Most had no idea what they were building. They were told only to work fast, precisely, and without questions. Uranium was refined. Plutonium was produced. Reactors rose in forests. Entire cities were built from nothing. The objective was explicit: to create a weapon capable of ending the war with a single blow. At dawn on July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico, an experimental device was detonated. No one knew exactly what would happen. There was no precedent, no real-world data. When the light appeared, it did more than tear open the desert sky. It shattered the limits of human imagination. For the first time in history, humanity released energy comparable to the core of a star on Earth. From that moment forward, every decision carried a different weight. Once the weapon existed, the question was no longer whether it could be used. The question became where. Targets were evaluated according to strict criteria: military significance, industrial value, degree of prior damage, geographic conditions suitable for measuring effects. One city stood out on the strategic maps, a military and logistical hub, largely intact after months of bombing. Its name was Hiroshima. By early August 1945, every factor converged. The war had gone on too long. Japan refused to surrender. A land invasion promised catastrophe. A new weapon was ready. The final decision was not impulsive. It was the result of 4 years of total war, millions of deaths, and fear of an even darker future. Somewhere between strategy and morality, history prepared to change direction, and the clock was counting down. There was no immediate ending after hell. The war did not stop when Hiroshima's center vanished. Power continued to move. Decisions still waited to be made. 3 days later, another bomb was used, not because Hiroshima was insufficient, but because the war had not yet ended. Nagasaki was not the primary target. Weather intervened. Heavy cloud cover obscured the intended city. The aircraft diverted. A narrow industrial valley, surrounded by hills, became the second ground zero. The explosion was more powerful than the first, yet the terrain limited its spread. This did not alter the nature of the event, only the scale. History does not remember Nagasaki for geography. It remembers it because it was the second time, and a second time carries a different meaning: intentional repetition. News of the 2 atomic attacks reached Tokyo unevenly. At first, reports were fragmented: a city completely destroyed, a new type of bomb, an unprecedented weapon. Military leaders did not immediately grasp the implications. Tokyo itself had burned under conventional bombing with higher immediate casualties. They still interpreted destruction through familiar frameworks. But as technical reports accumulated, the reality became undeniable. This was not an air raid, not a campaign, but a new category of warfare. As Tokyo struggled to comprehend the bombings, another event reshaped the situation entirely. The Soviet Union declared war. The Red Army surged into Manchuria. This was not symbolic. It was a massive, well-prepared offensive with overwhelming force. For years, Japanese leadership had clung to the hope that Moscow could serve as a mediator. That illusion collapsed in hours. From the north, a continental army advanced. From the south, American forces prepared for invasion. Japan was now trapped between 2 powers it could not resist. In those days, Japan's internal balance of power began to change. Military leaders still argued for continued resistance. They spoke of honor. They spoke of sacrifice. They spoke of forcing the enemy to pay a price. But reality had surpassed doctrine. This was no longer a war that could be extended for leverage. It was a war threatening the existence of the nation itself. And at this point, a figure long silent stepped forward. In modern Japanese history, the emperor rarely intervened directly in military decisions. His role was symbolic, spiritual, distant. August 1945 was not a normal moment. Faced with annihilation, Emperor Hirohito chose to act. Not publicly at first, but within the Supreme Council. He spoke briefly, but his words ended the debate. The war must end. Japan accepted surrender terms, not because its territory had been fully occupied, not because its armies had been entirely destroyed, but because continuation promised nothing but eradication. When the surrender announcement was broadcast, the emperor's voice reached the population for the first time. A voice once considered divine. There was no explicit mention of defeat, no apology, only an appeal to endure the unendurable. For a society built on honor and sacrifice, this marked a profound rupture. In the United States and among the Allies, the immediate reaction was relief. The war was over. No invasion would take place. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers would live. The atomic bomb was framed as a necessary instrument that had achieved its purpose. In the first days, few questions were asked. Victory overshadowed moral reflection. Only later, as images and detailed reports emerged, did the scale of the human cost become undeniable. Early predictions claimed the city would remain uninhabitable for decades. They were wrong. Within months, people returned. They erected temporary shelters. They cleared debris. They lived atop land once declared dead. Life did not return unchanged, but it did return. Plants grew through rubble. Flowers bloomed. A city began to rebuild itself, not to forget, but to survive. Its name remained Hiroshima. Its meaning did not. In the years that followed, the atomic bomb was remembered differently across nations. In the United States, it was framed as a decision that ended the war swiftly. In Japan, as a national tragedy. Each narrative contained truth. Each omitted elements. The role of the Soviet invasion was often minimized. The question of alternative endings remained largely unspoken. History is not shaped only by events. It is shaped by what societies choose to remember. After 1945, war between great powers did not disappear, but it was restrained by a new fear. Not fear of defeat, but fear of mutual annihilation. Nuclear weapons ceased to function as battlefield tools. They became instruments of deterrence. A cold paradox emerged. Peace maintained by the capacity for total destruction. Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not merely historical locations. They represent a permanent warning. Science itself has no morality. Morality lies in human choice. No technology is inherently good or evil. Only its use defines it. Decades later, the world still lives under the shadow of 1945. Nuclear weapons did not disappear. They multiplied. And with them remains a question without final resolution. The Second World War ended. Hiroshima did not. It endures as a warning, not through words, but through memory. Memory of a morning without warning. Memory of light. Memory of a world altered in 43 seconds. If war is the story of power, Hiroshima is the reminder that power always demands a final price, and that price is never paid only once. There was no warning, no preliminary blast, only light. In the first instant, the human brain did not register danger. The light arrived too fast, too intense, too unlike anything in lived experience. Those outdoors had no time to react. Those indoors had no time to shield themselves. Those in shelters did not yet understand what had occurred. The light did not illuminate, it erased form. At the point directly beneath the detonation, conventional physics no longer applied. Temperatures in the initial moment exceeded several thousand degrees Celsius. There was no time for burning, no time for pain, no time for awareness. Human bodies, wood, stone, thin metal were not destroyed in the usual sense. They were phase changed. What had been living matter became shadows fixed onto solid surfaces. Walls retained the outlines of people who had stood before them moments earlier. A negative imprint, proof of existence without the body, no blood, no screams, only absence. After light came force. The atmosphere compressed instantaneously, then expanded outward faster than any storm. faster than conventional explosives. The pressure waves surged through streets, passed through structures, and pulverized anything insufficiently reinforced. Those who survived the initial flash were hurled through space. Buildings collapsed like paper models. Glass shattered into millions of invisible blades. There was no front line, no rear area, no true shelter. Immediately after the blast wave came fire, not isolated fires, but simultaneous ignition. Wood, paper, cloth, household fuels ignited at once. Small fires merged, consuming oxygen from all directions and generating violent inward winds. People attempting to flee were pulled back toward the center. Those still moving were suffocated. Those who fell could not rise again. The fire did not spread, it consumed. Within minutes, the structure of a city disintegrated. There were no longer distinctions between civilian and military zones. No recognizable streets, no orientation. All familiar spatial references vanished. Survivors emerged from the ruins, unable to recognize where they stood. They could not find their homes. They could not find their families. They could not find themselves, and the city was not defeated. It was deconstructed. Those who lived bore injuries unlike any seen in previous wars. Skin burned deeply without charring. Clothing shredded while bodies beneath were more severely damaged. People far from the center were injured without understanding why. Many showed no obvious wounds. They walked, they spoke. But internally, cellular structures had been disrupted at microscopic levels. At the time, no one understood the concept of radiation exposure. There were no treatments, no protocols, only a delayed descent into death. When the fire subsided, something more terrifying followed. Silence. Not peace, but the absence of familiar sound. No vehicles, no crowds, no animals. Only isolated, intermittent moans from beneath the debris. Survivors searched for water. Their throats burned. Their mouths were dry. Their vision blurred. They drank from dark puddles. They did not know what they were absorbing. Hours later, the sky changed. Heavy, dark droplets began to fall. They clung to skin. They carried a metallic smell. The rain contained ash, vaporized debris, and radioactive particles drawn upward by the explosion and returned by condensation. Burn victims drank the rain to relieve thirst. Others washed wounds with it. They did not realize this was not relief. It was a prolonged poison. In the hours following the blast, organized rescue did not exist. Doctors were dead or wounded. Hospitals collapsed or burned. Medical supplies were buried. Those still capable of movement became improvised rescuers. They pulled people from rubble with bare hands. They had no bandages, no painkillers. The rules of war no longer applied. Neither did modern medicine. For survivors, time fractured. Day and night blended into smoke and ash. Daily rhythms disappeared. Bodies weakened rapidly. Many did not die immediately. They died days later. Weeks later, months later, hair fell out. Internal bleeding began. Infections emerged without clear cause. No one initially connected these symptoms to the blast. By the time connections were made, it was too late. A group remained suspended between life and death. They survived, but never returned to who they had been. They carried lifelong injuries. They carried formless fear. They carried memories without language. After the war, they became uncomfortable reminders, both victims and evidence. They came to be known collectively as atomic bomb survivors. When reconnaissance aircraft returned, the images revealed a stark truth. More than half the city had been leveled, the center reduced to a gray plain. Only a handful of reinforced concrete structures remained, hollowed shells. One stood close to the hypocenter. It survived not by chance, but by structure. Its skeletal frame would later become a symbol, not of resilience, but of emptiness. After that day, Hiroshima was no longer merely a place. It came to represent the ultimate boundary of destruction. The moment humanity crossed a line, a warning that endured beyond the war. No additional bombs were required to demonstrate power. Memory alone was sufficient. There was no heroism, no victory, no defeat in conventional terms, only consequence. This was not the story of a battle. It was the story of what happens when war reaches its logical extreme. Not an enemy destroyed, but the idea of war itself distorted. Years later, consequences continued to surface. Cancer, congenital defects, illnesses without clear explanation. Not all could be traced directly, but all shared a common origin, a detonation lasting 43 seconds, effects lasting generations. After Hiroshima, no strategist could think about war as before. Once hell had been opened, it could not be treated as if it had never existed. The question was no longer whether it could be done, but whether it could ever be repeated. If the Pacific War had a threshold, the summer of 1945 was where it stood. Not marked by a landing, not defined by a campaign, but sealed by a decision. At this stage, the war was no longer measured in divisions or fleets. It was measured in time and in will. Inside secure rooms in Washington, the invasion of Japan already had a name: Operation Downfall. This was not theoretical planning. It was a fully developed military blueprint. The first phase, Olympic, called for landings on Kyushu, the southern home island. The second Coronet envisioned a massive assault on the Kanto Plain, aimed directly at Tokyo. Maps covered tables. Landing beaches were marked. Divisions, transports, air cover, all calculated in detail. But alongside the maps lay casualty projections, numbers that refused to remain abstract. Hundreds of thousands of American dead, millions of Japanese casualties. A war extending into 1946, possibly beyond. Okinawa had already revealed the pattern. A small island turned into a slaughterhouse. If Okinawa was a warning, downfall was a forecasted catastrophe. Some American officers believed Japan was already collapsing. They argued that continued blockade and conventional bombing would eventually force surrender. But time did not operate as a neutral factor. Every additional day meant prisoners of war dying in camps, American air crews lost over Japan, political pressure rising at home, and beyond that, another clock was ticking. The Soviet Union was preparing to enter the war. Under earlier agreements, Moscow had pledged to attack Japan after Germany's defeat. That moment was approaching fast. If the Red Army moved into Manchuria, Korea, and beyond, the post-war balance in Asia would shift dramatically. This was no longer just about defeating Japan. It was about ending the war before the Soviets reshaped the outcome. In July 1945, Allied leaders met at Potsdam. Europe's war was over, but the global conflict was not. Diplomacy filled the conference halls. Calculation filled the silence. The United States arrived carrying a secret advantage: the successful Trinity test. The American president quietly informed the Soviet leader that the U.S. possessed a new weapon of extraordinary destructive power. No details, no demonstration, only implication. The message was not intended solely for Japan. It was aimed squarely at Moscow. On July 26, 1945, the Potsdam Declaration was issued. Its demand was explicit. Japan must surrender unconditionally or face complete destruction. There was no guarantee for the emperor, no negotiated exit for the military leadership. Tokyo did not reply with a formal rejection. Instead, it chose deliberate silence. Japanese leaders hoped to buy time. They searched for mediation, and the Soviet Union appeared to be their last remaining option. What they did not know was that Moscow had already chosen its side. Inside the American government, debate continued. Some scientists feared the moral consequences. Some officers proposed a demonstration explosion away from cities. But wars are not governed by laboratory ethics. A weapon built for war ultimately becomes a weapon used in war. The president signed the final order: no ceremony, no speech. Targets were confirmed, timing approved, the operation named. In the Pacific, the island of Tinian barely registered on world maps. In the summer of 1945, it became a hinge of history. Here, B-29 bombers were staged. Specialized crews worked under absolute secrecy. No insignia, no explanation. A bomb nearly 10 tons in weight was assembled piece by piece. It bore little resemblance to conventional weapons. Inside, it was not explosive force, but physical principle. The aircraft assigned to the mission carried a personal name: Enola Gay. Few on the island knew the full purpose of their work, but everyone sensed this was no ordinary mission. The bomb could not be armed on the ground. It would be activated only in flight. This was not absolute safety. It was necessity. There would be no second attempt, no margin for error. The flight lasted more than 4 hours. There was no combat, no interception, only waiting. Below Hiroshima functioned as a wartime city, a military and logistical hub, a place of depots, headquarters, and transport lines. It was also largely intact. That intactness made it ideal, not for mercy, but for measurement. There was no sustained alarm, no mass formation of bombers, just a single aircraft, high above visibility. When the bomb was released, nothing changed at ground level. For 43 seconds, the city remained itself. Then light appeared. Not the light of fire, not a flash, but erasure. The city center vanished. A pressure wave tore outward. Air itself became a weapon. In that instant, the war ended in a way no one had imagined when it began. After Hiroshima, every prior scenario lost relevance. Operation Downfall still existed on paper, but it was no longer the default path. Japan did not surrender immediately, but the psychological foundation had fractured. 3 days later, a second bomb was used. At the same time, the Soviet Union declared war. Japan faced annihilation from 2 directions. No time remained. No allies stood ready. No strategic space existed. The war did not end at Hiroshima, but its nature changed there. From that moment forward, conflict between great powers could never be separated from the shadow of nuclear weapons. The turning point was not simply the end of the Second World War. It was the beginning of a world forced to live with the means of its own destruction. No amphibious landing would ever equal that moment.